Welcome back to the science behind. You've probably heard people say that too many nutrients in your aquarium will cause algae. But why does that actually happen? How does algae go from being invisible to taking over surfaces, leaves, and the glass? In this video, we'll explore the processes that drive algae formation, the growth patterns it follows, and why different types of algae will actually appear under a different set of conditions. Before we can even begin to talk about nutrients and why algae forms, we need to take a step back and look at what algae actually is. Because the way it behaves in an aquarium only really makes sense once you understand what kind of organism you're dealing with. Algae is not a single organism, but rather a broad group of relatively simplistic photosynthetic organisms that are able to convert light into energy, much like plants do, but without the structural complexity that plants rely on, meaning they don't have roots, vascular systems, or differentiated tissues, and that simplicity is one of the reasons they're able to respond so quickly to changes in their environment. Now, the important part here, and the part that most people misunderstand, is that algae is actually always present in an aquarium system, regardless of how clean or well maintained it appears. It doesn't suddenly enter the tank when something goes wrong, and it doesn't originate from a specific event like overfeeding or a missed water change. Instead, it's already there from the very beginning, introduced through plants, water, surfaces, and even the surrounding air, existing at a microscopic level as individual cells or spores that are effectively impossible to exclude from a closed system like an aquarium. What changes is not the presence of it, but its visibility, because there is a fundamental difference between algae existing in the system and algae growing to the point where it becomes visible to us. And most aquariums spend a significant amount of time in a state where algae is present, but not actively expressing itself in a way that we as humans can see. A tank can look completely clean with clear glass, healthy plants, and no visible growth, while still containing a constant background level of algae which is distributed across surfaces and within biofilms. And that brings us to where algae actually resides inside the system, because contrary to what many people assume, it's not primarily a free-floating organism in the water column, but it actually instead tends to attach itself to surfaces like glass, substrate, hardscape, or plant leaves, and there it becomes part of a larger microbial layer often referred to as biofilm. Within that layer, algae can remain relatively inactive, coexisting with bacteria and other microorganisms without dominating the system, effectively existing in a kind of low growth or suppressed state that is maintained by competition and environmental constraints. But that state is actually not fixed, because under the right conditions, algae can transition from that background presence into an active growth, increasing in density and then spreading across surfaces until it becomes visible and eventually dominant within the aquarium. And this is why even tanks that appear perfectly clean are not free of algae, because clean in this context only refers to what is visible, not to what is actually present at the biological level. So the key idea to this is that algae is not something that appears suddenly in your aquarium, because it is actually already part of the system and it always has been. What changes is whether the conditions allow them to grow. Now that we've established that algae is always present in the system, we can return to the idea from the intro, which is that the excess nutrients will lead to algae, because this is where most explanations stop and also where most of the confusion will begin. In an aquarium, nutrients are constantly being introduced through normal biological processes. Fish produce waste, uneaten food will break down, and organic matter will decompose, all of which feed into the nitrogen cycle, where ammonia is converted into nitrite and then into nitrate. At the same time, phosphorus enters the system primarily through feeding, as fish food contains phosphates that accumulate as waste, while micronutrients and trace elements are either added deliberately through fertilization or released slowly from substrate and decaying material. So nutrients are not unusual, they're always present, and they're actually essential for the life in the aquarium. But they don't just sit there, because they are actually constantly being used. Plants use them for growth, bacteria incorporate them into their biological processes, and to some extent they are removed through water changes. So the system is always balancing two things at the same time: nutrients going in and nutrients being removed or used. And this is where the idea of excess becomes more precise. Because excess doesn't just simply mean that nutrient levels are high, it means that nutrients are entering the system faster than they're being utilized. In other words, they begin to accumulate. Now that alone creates pressure in the system, but it doesn't fully explain why algae appears, because nutrients themselves don't favor one organism over another. They are available to everything in the tank. What determines the outcome is how effectively different organisms are able to use those nutrients, and this is where the imbalance will come in. Higher plants, despite being more complex, are also more constrained. Their growth depends not just on nutrients, but on light, CO2 availability, and internal physiological limits. If any one of those factors is insufficient, their ability to take up nutrients slows down, even if those nutrients are present in large amounts. Algae, on the other hand, operates under far fewer constraints. It has a much simpler structure, faster reproduction, and lower overall requirements, which allows it to respond much more quickly when nutrients are available but not being fully utilized by other organisms. So what you end up with is not just excess nutrients in isolation, but nutrients that are effectively unclaimed. They are present in the system, but they're not being taken up efficiently by plants or other competing organisms, and that creates an opening. And that opening is what algae will then exploit. This is also where concepts like limiting factors come into play. According to Liebig's law of the minimum, growth is controlled not by the total amount of resources available, but by the one that is in shortest supply. So even if nutrients are abundant, a limitation in CO2 or light can slow plant growth to the point where they are no longer able to keep up with nutrient input. At that point, accumulation will begin, and more importantly, availability increases relative to uptake. And that's the condition where algae starts to gain ground. So when we say that excess nutrients cause algae, what we are really describing is a system where nutrients input exceeds the system's ability to use them effectively, creating a situation where algae can step in and take advantage of what's left behind. And that leads us to the key idea for this chapter. Algae does not grow simply because nutrients are present, but because they are available in a way that other organisms in the system are not able to fully utilize. Once nutrients are available in a form that algae can exploit, the next question is why algae grows so effectively while other organisms struggle, because understanding this is what explains why blooms happen in systems that otherwise can seem perfectly healthy. The first factor is energy, specifically light. Algae is extremely efficient at converting light into usable energy for growth, far more than most higher plants in the same environment, because it has a very simple structure, with every cell exposed directly to the light, rather than relying on complex tissues or shading that reduces overall efficiency. This allows algae to start photosynthesizing immediately whenever light is present, giving it a head start before other plants can even get to respond. Then there's CO2, which is another limiting factor in any planted system. Unlike complex plants, which require stable CO2 levels for optimal growth, algae can actually tolerate fluctuations and low concentrations of CO2, continuing to assimilate carbon even when the system is actually not perfectly regulated. That ability to use CO2 more flexibly is a huge advantage, because it means algae can capitalize on moments where higher plants are slowed by instability or scarcity. Competition also plays a critical role. Algae doesn't exist in isolation. It shares space with plants, microbes, and other biofilm organisms, but because of its structural simplicity and rapid reproduction cycles, it can colonize surfaces faster, covering glass, substrate, or plant leaves before other organisms have a chance to establish themselves. The combination of speed and simplicity allows algae to exploit niches that are inaccessible to slower growing or more structurally complex plants. Surface area matters too. Algae can spread thinly over any available surfaces, maximizing exposure to light and nutrients simultaneously, whereas plants rely on larger and again more complex leaves, roots, and stems that are constrained by morphology. The structural difference further reinforces algae's advantage under conditions where resources are abundant but unevenly utilized. And reproduction cycles make a difference as well. algae can divide and expand rapidly, often doubling in biomass in hours or days, while plants operate on a timescale of weeks to months to even years. That speed allows algae to respond instantly to favorable conditions, overtaking areas that plants would take far longer to colonize. The combination of all these factors, energy efficiency, flexible CO2 use, rapid reproduction, and structural simplicity, as well as surface exploitation, creates a system in which algae doesn't just grow when nutrients are available, it actively outcompetes any other organisms under the certain right conditions, taking advantage of imbalances that would otherwise remain invisible. Now that we understand how algae grows in general, the next question is, why doesn't it all look the same? Because the type of algae that appears in a tank is actually not random. Each species responds to a very specific set of conditions, and learning to read those conditions is what allows us to understand what the tank's really doing. Take green dust algae, for example. This type tend to thrive in areas with very high light exposure, especially on surfaces that are unstable or constantly disturbed, because the cells can attach quickly but also need repeated access to light to maintain growth. Its presence is almost like a fingerprint of intense light hitting surfaces that are not being colonized effectively by plants or other organisms. Hair algae, by contrast, emerges when there is a combination of excess nutrients and inconsistent CO2 levels. It prefers environments where light is steady, but carbon availability will fluctuate, allowing it to exploit moments where plants slow down while the nutrients it needs remain abundant. This combination of abundance and instability creates the long, filamentous strands that often will frustrate aquarists like myself because they go faster than manual removal can keep up with. Blackbeard algae represents yet another set of conditions. It prefers areas with moderate to strong flow and CO2 instability. The movement of water provides a constant supply of nutrients and prevents stagnation of the algae, but fluctuations in dissolved carbon will create stress for plants while allowing the hardier algae to persist. Diatoms, the brown algae that appears in new or mature systems, exploit an entirely different niche. They rely on silicates, which are often high in tap water, and they flourish in environments where the microbial and plant communities are still developing, giving them a temporary advantage that usually fades as the system becomes more balanced and matures. Cyanobacteria, sometimes often actually mistaken for slime or algae mats, are a completely other story. They appear in low flow areas in systems with nutrient imbalance and especially where competition from other organisms are weak. They are opportunists, thriving in stagnation and taking advantage of conditions that limit plant and beneficial microbes. Each type of algae then is a signal, an environmental fingerprint, so to say. Green dust algae tells you the surfaces and lights are exposed. Hair algae signals inconsistent CO2. Blackbeard algae shows flow and carbon issues. Diatoms indicate immaturity or silicates. Cyanobacteria point to low flow and low competition. And this is why the same tank can actually shift between algae types over time as light, CO2, flow or nutrients availability changes. Different species exploit the new niches, sometimes replacing what was previously dominant. A tank, as you probably know, is never static and algae responds faster than most other organisms can, making it an immediate indicator of these subtle shifts that normally would be invisible. So the key idea is actually very simple. Different algae are not just a nuisance, they are also indicators of different system conditions, each revealing a story about the environment they are thriving in, and understanding that story is essential if you want to control your tank or prevent unwanted growth of algae. Looking at algae in your tank isn't about judging it, it's about understanding it. Every type, every patch, every bloom is a sign of what's happening beneath the surface, how light, CO2, flow and nutrients are interacting, and where the system is out of balance. Through this episode, we've seen that algae is always there, quietly waiting. We've followed how nutrients accumulate, how algae's biology led to take advantage of gaps, and how different species appear under a different set of conditions. Each pattern is a clue, a fingerprint of your aquarium's inner workings. The takeaway for this video is simple. Algae is not only a villain, it's also a mirror. It shows you what your tank is really doing, not just what it looks like. And once you start reading those signs, you stop chasing symptoms and start managing a system that actually works. Algae doesn't need to be perfect, and your tank doesn't need to be spotless. The water doesn't need to sparkle to be healthy. What matters is balance, understanding, and also paying attention to the signals that your system gives you. Thank you for watching this episode of The Science Behind. If you have any ideas for a future episode, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.